Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for today's instalment of foreCASt from Citizens Advice Scotland. We've lots of folks here to join us today on this public debt episode. So we'll just give it literally just a moment for people to log in, get a cup of tea. Hopefully everyone's had the opportunity to have lunch so that you can sit back and take in this episode with us over the next hour. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. As this is a webinar for participants, cameras and microphones are off, but there is a question and answer function that we'd love you to be using throughout the hour. It's just at the bottom of the call. If you don't see the icon there for it, if you press the three dots for more, and the Q&A function should just pop up for you. Please do ask us questions as we're going through this afternoon's call. So good afternoon and welcome. This is the first episode of our election special series of foreCASt. The Holyrood elections feel like they're coming at an incredibly important time, and there's some really important topics that we know that we need to be discussing, the issues that are perhaps causing people in Scotland some of the most harm, and what we really need to be looking at are what are the solutions to stop that harm. This afternoon, we're going to be focusing on public debt recovery here in Scotland. We've got an absolutely brilliant lineup of speakers for you to hear from the Citizens Advice Network and beyond. And this should hopefully be a really participative conversation. Please do be using the chat function as we go along to pop in your questions as we get going. We'll take every opportunity to answer those questions as we go. So thank you for choosing to be with us. And without further ado, I think let's get us started. Our first two speakers are from the Citizens Advice Scotland. My colleague David is Director of Impact, and he's going to take us through the sort of what we describe as big picture view of what's happening with the network and public debt. And then we're going to hand straight over to Myles, our Head of Financial Health, who's really going to take us through a bit of a deep dive of what's happening with council debt and council debt recovery here in Scotland. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Emma. And I want to start with a quick word on why we're doing this pre-election series. And there's one of Scotland's leading charities. We are politically impartial, but we are not politically neutral, because neutrality would mean being silent to the harm that we see, that our network sees every single day in communities in every corner of Scotland. Now, there is power and there is purpose in what we do, both in terms of the unrivaled, person-centred, wrap-around immediate support that our network offers, but also what we can change in the long term to be preventative, to stop people from falling in the river upstream rather than just pulling them out, because we are not passive observers in the landscape around us. We're active participants. We directly influence and change and shape policy and legislation, and we drive better outcomes. And moreover, we believe that it's our duty and our obligation to do so. That is hardwired into the reasons why we exist, because the decisions taken, or indeed not taken, over the course of the coming weeks and over the course of the next Parliament impact on all of us. Many of the issues that we identify across this series may not be new to you. Many of them you'll have heard us speak about many times before. Public debt is the theme for today's session, and the themes have been very carefully and very consciously chosen based on our data and insight, based on where the harm is. And as you'll hear us repeat across this series, we can't be back here in 5 years' time saying the same things. Now, there is unparalleled authenticity in our evidence base. It is entrenched in the experiences of real people, and we want to take that insight right into the heart of the debate in the months ahead with this series. Our advice changes lives. We support an extraordinary number of people every single year, and when you do that, you build up a real vastness of insight and understanding. We're determined to make that insight count. This election series is a key part of how we will do that. And it's a very particular type of insight, because we see people who are experiencing harm and where intervention and other forms of support are needed most, because typically and naturally people present for advice when something's gone wrong, when systems have failed. A narrative that will no doubt punctuate this pre-election period, and does so in almost every election, is that we hear a lot about difficult choices, don't we? But be in no doubt, the people facing the toughest of decisions, the hardest of choices, are like those walking through the doors of the Citizens Advice Bureau every day. Because after more than a decade of austerity, of perma-crisis, we are so often the last refuge for people out of options, after rebounding around broken public services and closed doors. These experiences must be heard at all times, but especially so at election time, to help close that proximity gap between people experiencing harm and the people who can end that. If our evidence shows where the harm is, for our first episode, our evidence base took us to public debt. Now, to be clear, when we talk about public debt, we're not talking about sovereign debt, we're not talking about government borrowing. When we say public debt, we're talking about arrears owed to public bodies such as council tax, rent, deductions to social security and so on. In the context of the Scottish Parliament election, our focus is on what the next Scottish Government should do. But it would be remiss not to mention that this is also an issue for UK Government, and particularly in the context of deductions to universal credit. And while we know that the move to reduce the deduction rate is a step in the right direction, it's only scratching the surface in terms of the systemic change we need to see in that payment. Over half of people in Scotland to receive universal credit have a deduction to a level of support that we all know is already inadequate to meet the essentials that all of us need. And that's taking money away from people who can least afford it at a time when they need it most. Now, whether this happens at Scottish Government level, whether it happens at UK Government level, to sum it up in its simplest form, public debt happens when systems fail. And think on that concept for just a moment. To get into a position where you owe money not to a bank or a lender, a consumer creditor, but to a public service provider, to a public institution. It's involuntary. To return to that concept of making choices, it's more often not a choice. Again, public debt happens when public systems fail. And on debt more broadly, it's essential that the language we use to describe people's circumstances catches up with the reality. The cliched, hackneyed images you see on news websites, the stock models fretting over bills with an old school calculator on the table. This ain't that. The reality is way more pernicious than that. It's people getting into debt just to live, to survive. And it's not just this public sector debt. If you look at average debt within the private rented sector, it's at £4,000. And what we see, double that of social tenants, incidentally, another failing system. If we turn to a failing market, the average debt we see on energy is now around £2,700. Again, let's be absolutely clear here. That is debt accumulated just to meet the essentials that all of us need, and it's locking people in poverty. As Emma said at the outset, a challenge we hold ourselves to highlight the problems, yeah, but to be really clear on solutions. In a few moments, my colleague Myles will set out what the next Scottish Government needs to do on public debt based around three overarching principles. Stop the harm, pause the process, rewire the system. But we also invite and indeed challenge our audience to think about these solutions. So again, as Emma said, do keep the questions coming in the chat function, but also keep that solutions focus. Where's the harm? What needs to change? And if demand for advice is an indicator on harm, then on public debt it's consistently clear, year after year, the main driver is council tax. And I think it's commonplace that council tax is a key election battleground, isn't it? Less common, though, that then translates into notable and meaningful reform. And that's something that is borne out across multiple parliaments now. What we want to show you today is what that means when harm is known, when harm is tolerated, and when nothing really changes. Debt is a symptom of a failing system. And I had a conversation with my colleague ahead of today where I was saying, do you ever feel like we're just saying the same things? And as I said in the opening of my own comments, we simply cannot be back here in 5 years' time saying the same things on public debt. Let's look to the evidence that's on screen at the moment. But to pick out just one insight from this, today, the average level of council tax is £3,600. 5 years ago, it was £3,300. So this isn't a story of harm continued. This isn't a story of harm left unaddressed. It's worse than that. It's harm exacerbated and it's harm tolerated, because I feel that much of this will not come as a surprise, and particularly to our CAB frontline colleagues today, and that makes it so much worse that we know this and it's tolerated. public debt happens when systems fail. And from the perspective of our network, systemic failure is exemplified by people who keep coming back to our essential frontline services, as the system keeps throwing people into crisis year after year. Now, of those advised in council tax during 2025, 1 in 5 had received the same advice at least once across the past 5 years. So debt's not neatly encapsulated within a single year. It is persistent and entrenched and recurring. And what does it look like then when you're living that? Well, a colleague recently shared with me Fiona's experience, and that's on screen at the moment. But a few things I want to draw out: that recurrence of council tax problems and that escalation of harm. First presenting in 2019, arrears doubling by 2021, still struggling right into late 2023. And of course, it's not just council tax alone either, is it? But a last word on this one, and we should never lose sight of this. Look at the outcome, look at the difference the cab makes. Council tax arrears now way down at £100. Annual income up £9,000, genuinely game-changing outcomes and interventions, but it shouldn't have to be this hard. Debt's designed into the system, and it's our assertion, therefore, that debt can be designed out of the system. And that's the challenge we set for ourselves, and indeed from that Scottish Parliament, that again, we cannot be back here in 5 years' time. And as Myles will go on to speak about, there's a real furious pace to council tax debt recovery, and that sets it apart from other types of debt. That at the very moment you need a wee bit of leeway, that space to breathe, you get the reverse. You miss a month's payment, you get billed for the entire year. And what effectively happens here is that a blip can be turned into a crisis. And for me, again, this amounts to debt by design. It almost guarantees debt, doesn't it? It entrenches hardship. It traps people in poverty. And again, just as that's been designed into the system, it can and it must be designed out. Nothing happens in neat isolation, does it? Nothing in any of our lives is a single, unconnected, uncomplicated moment. On screen at the moment is a visual of what's been happening in terms of diligence. Now, these are the formal steps that creditors can take to legally enforce the recovery of debt. And the trend, and indeed the spike here, I'm not going to get into the technicalities of this, but that trend and that spike should be immediately apparent. Now, the point that I'll make here, that across that timeline, everyone knew there was a cost of living emergency. That is far from over, by the way. Another one of those, do we need to keep saying that type statements. Everyone knew that the fallout of that would be deep, it would be long lasting. And what did the system do when people needed most support? Well, the system did what the system does. And moreover, it doesn't work. And this is the clincher for me here. It's really not very effective. Now, a few years ago, there was an FOI release from a Scottish local authority, around £1.4 million spent chasing over £50 million of council tax debt. Of that £50 million, just under 400,000 was recovered. That's a recovery rate of 0.8%. For every pound of debt recovered, it costs £3.50. So it costs 3 times more what was recovered, more than 3 times more. I raise this point here in the context of public service reform, another issue that will rightly dominate discourse over the coming months. If you look at the existing public sector reform strategy, really strong, really compelling work, by the way. 3 main pillars, which I think that we would all, no matter what part of the sector you're coming from, we would all subscribe to, around prevention, around joined up services, around efficiency. Where does that figure in all of this when we've got systems that are failing citizens, but systems that are failing on its very own measurements of success? So if nothing changes, nothing changes. And I think the story that we've seen here is of not enough changing. It's a story of debt tolerated and of harm normalised. So enough tinkering, enough small-scale interventions. When a system is failing, you need to change the system. And we believe that a very different way and a very different system is not just possible, but it's essential. And that's one that my colleague Myles is going to set out for you now.
Yep, hi folks. Apologies for that slight delay there. Thanks, David, for that. I'm going to do a deep dive into council tax debt, and what I want to talk about, and David framed it earlier on. He was talking about how council tax debt is the biggest form of public sector debt, and from the cab service perspective, it's the most common type of debt that people bring to the cab service every year, and has been the case for many years now. And I'll give a wee story to illustrate that. I've been working at CAS in two different spells, and my first spell was 25 years ago, and there was a picture sent to me the other day of me marching on Parliament with a report. It was a parliamentary officer at CAS at the time, and the report was on council tax debt, and we were trying to change the world with this report as we walked into Holyrood with that. Now, the thing about that report is I looked at it the other day, and it's exactly the recommendations, the problems, the suggested answers are very similar to what they are now. That was 25 years ago, right? And here we are, we're still at this. We need the action now. We've got an opportunity at this election to make a difference, and I want to go over today some of the issues that we want to take forward with the manifestos. But one thing I do want to focus on today is on council tax debt recovery. That's a big issue for us in this overall context of public sector debt. The system isn't designed for people who are struggling with council tax debt. It's designed for people who are refusing to pay, but not designed for those people who are struggling to pay. And I want to kind of carry that theme on throughout the rest of the presentation. So why don't we have a look at the causes of council tax debt? So a few years ago, we did some research in council tax debt into the causes, and we found four things. Firstly, low incomes. People just simply didn't have enough money. Secondly, people were therefore prioritising essential living costs like rent, energy, food, housing, and so on. People were unaware that there was any consequence of not paying your council tax debts or not paying your council tax payments. So the bin still got emptied, the street lights still went on, the school stayed open, and nothing really tangible happened if you didn't pay your council tax. And then finally, there was an issue around the lack of understanding of the speed and the harshness of the debt recovery, and that's what I want to kind of touch on further later on. But I want to tell you about Michelle, someone who used the cab service, and she had council tax debt, and her story can be described in the following way. For me, the basics to live were more important than council tax. My priorities were food, electric, clothing for my child, rent, then council tax. I didn't see any immediate consequence from not paying, but there is if I can't pay living costs. It's what I focused on. I didn't give any thought to the arrears that were building up. I didn't know how the system worked, and I'm not a bad person. It wasn't because I didn't want to pay. I'm on a low income, so had to prioritise. But I received letters from my council that suggested they would take money from my bank account. So I sought help from my local Citizens Advice Bureau, who helped maximise my income so I could repay some of my council tax debt. So much in that reflects what we found in our own research. But one thing I do want to highlight about what Michelle said there was that she said she wasn't a bad person. She wasn't not wanting to pay, she just didn't have the means to pay. And that's a critical aspect of how the system is working against people who are struggling to pay. So what is the debt recovery process? Effectively, if someone misses 1 month payment, a reminder is sent. If that isn't paid at that point, then a letter demanding payment for the full year bill is followed, and then there's a notice of legal debt recovery. And then there's money taken from someone's bank account in what's known as a bank arrestment. Now, the process here, it's too quick and it's too harsh. And it's too quick because within a matter of weeks of falling behind with a single payment, you're facing a bank arrestment and money being taken from your account and your account being frozen. It's too harsh because after missing 1 month's payment, you're quickly facing a bill for the entire 12 months. And you've got to ask yourself, I'm sure you're saying, how can someone pay for 12 months if they can't pay for a single month? Well, that's a very good question. The system is designed for those who are able to pay but refuse to pay, whereas people are getting caught up like Michelle, who want to pay but can't pay. And we know there's a really good intention and there's support and help from local authorities out there to help people in that scenario. But the system of recovery kicks in straight away and it's very quick, and it's very harsh, and it leads to an exacerbation of some of the debt that people are incurring. The system isn't helping, so all the good intentions of the local authorities don't really get a chance to show themselves, because the system at source is causing some of these issues. And it isn't just exacerbating council tax debt. Council tax recovery also has a wider financial impact on people in three ways. Council tax debt takes money away from other essential living costs. The prioritisation of paying your council tax debt takes over everything else. So suddenly money is taken away from other bills, other costs, or maybe other debts, for example. When it comes to the bank arrestments, a lump sum is taken off as opposed to maybe done in instalments. Now, there is a protected minimum balance, which protects some core costs for people when it comes to a bank arrestment, which is a good thing. But there are others whereby the money that's taken off is still needed for other issues, and that just takes away from other payments and other costs too. And the final thing is bank arrestments, where they freeze the bank accounts for a period of time. And that effectively leaves somebody unbanked, which is a terrible position for anyone to be in. It means they can't make payments, can't make bills, and they can't withdraw money from the cash machine. They're a really precarious situation. Now, I'm not going to mince my words here and say that the debt recovery process, when you think of it in these terms, it acts like a wrecking ball on people's finances. And we in the CAB network see people coming in with their council tax debt. They're in a financial predicament, and we do everything we can to give them the support they need. We do everything we can to give them income maximisation, because the purpose of that advice is to get them to be able to make some form of repayment back on their council tax debt because of the consequences of not paying it. This is a situation that we can't let continue. We need some reform. So we're looking at this election to put forward a key manifesto ask. And that manifesto ask is a whole-scale review of council tax administration and debt recovery. We've had change over the years. It's been a bit piecemeal. We've had a bit of legislation here. We've had a bit of regulations over there. But we've not had something which brings everything together. There's so many arms and legs: council tax, debt, recovery, prevention. There's so much to it. And we think there needs to be a system which is built that is durable, factors in as many things as possible. It works for the individual. It's fair for the person who's struggling with a council tax debt. It's also fair for councils. It also protects the council income, and it works for them as well. We're not talking about, it doesn't necessarily have to be ripping up the entire system, but what it does need is some major surgery, adjustments and changes to make sure that those who are struggling to pay aren't further damaged by the very system that is in place. So there are some ideas that would come under this review. And these are, and I should say before I get into this, the time is right for a review in Scotland, because in Wales, they've already had this review, and in Wales, they've started to carry out some of these changes, some of the changes I'll just talk to you about in a wee second. And England is set to follow suit, and Scotland should not be left on the sidelines of this. So here are some ideas. Increase the time between falling behind in your first payment and the debt recovery process kicking in. That's very important. In Wales, they've done that. That's gone up to 62 days from 31 days. 62 days is really good, and that's really important, because I always people to get support and advice from agencies like the CAB service, get back on their feet, find a way to be able to make that payment. Clearer communication in council tax bills and reminders, improved signposting to agencies like the Citizens Advice Bureau service or to the council advice services as well. Best practice guidance to make sure that people are aware of how to proceed with paying their council tax and what's expected around council tax recovery. There's other ideas that are kicking about, such as pre-action checklist, better use of council data, single recovery point within a council rather than different departments, and a reform of bank arrestment. There's a range of issues that we put into this review. The key is we need a review, and then we can take things from there. Couple of takeaways for you from today I want to leave you with, which is some people want to pay but can't. The debt recovery process isn't aligned to help. The debt recovery process is fast, it's harsh, debt recovery can act as a wrecking ball on wider finances. The recovery process needs to slow down. We think there can be an improvement of council tax income for local authorities if people are getting more chance to actually make repayments that they wouldn't otherwise be able to make if the system was slowed down and they got support. Reduced recovery costs as well. And we're really needing the next Scottish Government to deliver that council tax debt reform. Just to conclude, in the future, we want to see people like Michelle be able to pay her rent and pay her energy and pay her council tax. We want Michelle to be able to be aware of the difficulties that come if you don't pay your council tax, but we also want, if she can't pay her council tax in the future, that there is time, support, patience and understanding on her side to give her a chance to get back on her feet and to make those payments without the system making things worse for her. We can't wait another 25 years. Michelle can't wait another 25 years. I can't wait another 25 years. I am not marching in the Parliament in 25 years in a Zimmer frame. I'm not going to do that. But the action is required now. We can't even wait 5 years for another election. The time is now to do this. So we need to stop the harm. We need to pause the process, and we need to rewire the system. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Myles and David. Really such a powerful way of kind of demonstrating the depth and scale of this issue for people all across Scotland, I think highlighted particularly by hearing some of the experiences of Fiona and indeed Michelle. But equally recognising that this is a problem that can be solved, that there are solutions that exist to the harms that people face, and great to begin to start to unpack what some of those solutions are. And I encourage folks to continue to put your questions, your comments in the question and answer section. And we will, as we move to questions, try and make sure that we can get through as many of those as possible. I'm delighted to be able to move on to our next set of speakers. First of all, we're going to be hearing from Professor Morag Traynor. Professor Traynor is an academic with a real interest in researching poverty and socio-economic inequalities. We've had the privilege at Citizens Advice Scotland of connecting with Morag with her work on public debt and council tax debt over the last few years. So we're really looking forward to hearing some of your expertise and insight. Once we've heard from Morag, we're then going to hear from Gail Bell. Gail is CEO of Haddington Cab over in East Lothian. And we're really delighted to have Gail join us so that we can hear, I guess, up close some of the experiences of people in her local community who are on the sharp end of facing public debt and what her teams think solutions need to look like. So I'll hand over to you, Morag.
Thanks very much, Emma. Just checking I'm able to be heard, yeah? Excellent. So thanks for coming here this afternoon. I am going to show you 4 slides, each of which has a graph on. And I apologise in advance for those who don't like graphs, but my time here will be to explain what these graphs are. I've been asked to tell you about the profile of people with public debt in Scotland. Now, if it can emphasise that I have been working with Aberlour Children's Charity, Trussell Trust and One Parent Families Scotland for the past 18 months using Citizens Advice data and latterly step change data combined with Citizens Advice data to look at this problem across the whole of Scotland. Now, because I was working for Aberlour Children's Charity, I limited the age range to those up to age 65 because we had a focus on children. So I've eliminated all the people over the age of 65 because I was interested in working people and such like. So the first chart here is it's a logistic model. So what it does is it looks at probabilities, and these are in terms of odds. For those of you who know about a flutter or two, you will know what an odds is. If you don't, I'm going to explain it to you now. The red line is when 1 equals 1. That's like having odds of 1 to 1. That means there is no difference whatsoever. Anything to the right of that red line that's higher than 1 is an increased likelihood of something happening to you. Anything to the left of that red line, which is lower than 1, is a decreased likelihood of something happening to you. So if we look at this, and this takes into account all the other factors, these are taking into account everything else. And let me explain what I mean by that. If we look at those living in council or housing association properties, they are 2.85 times more likely, that's almost 3 times more likely to have public debt, which you might think sounds reasonable because it includes things like rent. If you're a lone parent, you are 1.5 times more likely to have public debt. You're a third more likely if there's a disability in the family, and 16% more likely if you are a large family. Where it says there is no difference between men and women in their likelihood, that is because the lone parenthood is in there and disability in the family is in there. And it's predominantly women who fill these roles. So where there's no difference between men and women in gender, that's where there is no lone parenthood, no disability in the family, and no children in the family. That would be if they didn't have these social roles. Women do have higher levels of public debt, but only because of these social roles such as lone parenthood, caring, disabilities, etc. And the next slide is not so much about probability. You saw that lone parents were 1.5 times more likely to have public debt, and carers were less likely to have public debt. Now remember, the carers were less likely to have it, but if they were also lone parents, they were more likely to, or if there was also disability for themselves, they were more likely to. But what this shows us is these are the average amounts owed. So we can see that a carer might have a lower likelihood of being in public debt, but when they do owe money, they owe the most. They have got the highest level of public debt. Similarly, when we look at women, they had an equal chance of being in public debt with men if they did not have social roles relating to caring, children, lone parenthood, but they are slightly higher levels of public debt. The red is when it's higher, the green is when it's lower. And what this shows us is that those with a disability have among the lowest amounts in total of public debt, although they are 30% more likely to have public debt, but what they owe is lower. There's a couple of things that could be informing this. It could be the fact that, and when we looked at it more broadly last year, we did a conference that very much did a deep dive into disability. And what we saw that actually disability benefits were really helping. They were doing good things. So when there was this proposal last year by the UK government to cut disability benefits, that was a bit alarming to us, and we brought out a report on public debt and disability last June, and that will be found on Aberlour's website if you're interested. Similarly, I'm not going too much into women, gender and their social roles here, because in November we published a report which you can find on Aberlour's website that was called The Gendered Impact of Public Debt. So on Aberlour's website you can see all the reports that we have done together on this area. So I will just take this forward to my final 2 slides, and moving on, we come to another probability. And this one I've decided to do by geographical factors. The red odds, the odds ratios, are about SIMD quintiles. That's the lowest 4, and each one of these is being compared to the 5th, which is the most advantaged, the least deprived. So this is that type of comparison. And you can see that the lowest quintile of income is 3 times more likely to have public debt, but there is a social gradient here. Every single level of deprivation has a higher likelihood of having public debt than the least deprived. If you're in quintile 4, which is up at the 80% mark of advantage rather than deprivation, you still have 63% more likely to have public debt than someone who's in that 5th income quintile, that most advantaged. So we call that a social gradient, where you're seeing change at every level and aspect of the socio-demographics in society. If we come down to the blue dots on the chart, we're looking at the urban-rural split. And what I did was I took CAS and step change data, and I split this by the 3-part urban-rural split that the Scottish Government has, which is remote rural, urban, and accessible towns rural. And what we can see, so what we're comparing these 2 blue ones too is we're comparing them to the one in the middle, the accessible towns, which are just a little bit rural. So probably the things you'll find across the central belt that aren't the big cities, in Fife, in Tayside, Perthshire, but that aren't the major conurbations. And you find that people in remote rural locations are 44% more likely to have public debt, and those in the very urban locations, the main cities, are 43% more likely to have public debt. So there is that real pressure here on the rurality and the urban aspects of Scottish life. My final slide shows what the average amounts owed by urban rural is. And you can see that although the accessible rural, the middle one, had the least likelihood of having public debt because urban and rural were over 40% higher levels of debt overall, the amount owed is much higher across the total public debt, council tax debt, fuel debt is higher in all the rural areas compared to urban. And it's only urban that has the higher rental debt, whether that's PRS, the private rental sector, or RSL, which is the registered social landlord, so which is council and housing associations. So as you might expect, the very urban areas have higher levels of, not levels of, but amounts of public debt on housing. But the rural areas have particularly high levels of debt across public debt. And that's something for us to think about, because what is happening here, if I had to hazard a guess, because the data doesn't tell us, then I would say that people in rural communities are either waiting longer before they come for support, and that could be because they don't have the accessibility, there isn't something nearby, or it could also be that there is the fear of being known or recognised to local services. And so this is something that we need to consider in this space, is do rural services, rural areas need a different approach to the urban services. And that's been a very whistle-stop tour, and thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon. I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about public sector housing debt. So rent arrears and housing related debt are among the most common and complex issues in the CAB service deals with. Behind each case is not just missed payments, but layers of ill health, caring responsibilities, grief, and systems that are not designed for people who are struggling rather than refusing to pay. I want to share a case that demonstrates this clearly alongside the recurring themes we see time and time again when clients face housing debt and court action. And this case highlights how quickly matters can escalate, how easily people can disengage when overwhelmed, and how vital timely, holistic support is in preventing homelessness. I want to begin by looking at the underlying causes that led this client into arrears and court action. They were around low income and poor health, competing priorities and caring responsibilities, trauma, grief, and long-term stress, lack of understanding of housing processes and protections, and fear of engaging with landlords and creditors. This client was caring full-time for her adult son, who has epilepsy and requires 24-hour supervision following brain surgery, whilst also supporting her father with serious health conditions. And she herself has multiple long-term health conditions and struggles with fatigue. And managing rent arrears was not a refusal to pay, but something that became unmanageable alongside everything else in her life. Her son also became unwell while serving in the army and was initially diagnosed with depression. And after a prolonged fight for further investigation, he was diagnosed with epilepsy. And his local seizures are life-threatening and require constant supervision, which the client provides. And the client also experienced the sudden death of her mother, her main source of support, due to a ruptured aneurysm, and she remains in a prolonged state of grief. And at the same time, she's caring for her father, who is deteriorating health and has required multiple hospital visits. The client herself lives with Barrett's syndrome, osteoarthritis, chronic back pain, sleep apnea, and is prescribed strong pain medication, and fatigue significantly impacts her daily functioning. And this is the context in which her rent arrears accrued. Engagement and behaviour patterns that we commonly see are basically cycles of non-payment, often learned or multi-generational. Clients overwhelmed and fearful of contacting landlords or creditors. Negative perceptions of housing providers and enforcement processes. Drop-off in engagement after initial advice appointments. And the belief that debt solutions such as sequestration are a quick fix. In this case, the client disengaged during a court continuation period due to her son undergoing brain surgery, repeated hospital admissions, COVID within the family, and overwhelming caring responsibilities. And this pattern mirrors what we see across many cases. People don't disengage because they don't care, but because they do not have the capacity to cope. The client was referred to Cabbar Housing Association due to rent arrears and impending court action, and a continuation was initially granted to allow time for sequestration to be explored. During this period, contact was lost despite multiple attempts, and when the client re-engaged the day before court, it became clear her circumstances had significantly worsened. Despite this, the Housing Association indicated they would proceed to decree as sequestration had not yet been submitted. CAB intervened, providing detailed background information and advocating that eviction would be unreasonable given the circumstances. And this demonstrates how quickly housing processes move and how easily vulnerable clients can fall through the cracks. But there's a wider impact of housing debt enforcement. Things like stress and deterioration of physical and mental health, increased risk of homelessness, clients juggling multiple crises with no safety net, short-term crisis payments rather than sustainable solutions, and clients throwing money at arrears at breaking point without long-term planning. And as with many cases, the pressure of court action compounded the client's already fragile situation. The threat of eviction added to her distress at a time when her son was repeatedly hospitalised and in pain. Following CAB advocacy, the Housing Association agreed not to oppose a further continuation, and the court granted a 9-week continuation, allowing the client to work with us. This outcome provided immediate relief and stability during a critical period. And actions taken included a referral to Carers of East Lothian to support the client and complete an adult carer support plan under the Carers Scotland Act of 2016. Support to progress sequestration were appropriate. Income maximisation advice was given, and access to food bank and fuel bank support was also provided. And the client was delighted to learn support existed, and she felt less isolated. Key learning and solutions from this. This case really reflects wider systemic issues and we repeatedly encounter. Enforcement processes often move faster than clients can cope. Vulnerable clients disengage when overwhelmed, not through choice. Sequestration is increasingly pushed as a default solution, even when inappropriate. Clients are not always fully informed of options and consequences. Financial education and tenancy sustainment support are critical. And solutions to these include increased financial education, budgeting, debt prioritisation, and life planning. Clear information on how to maintain a tenancy. Better awareness of advice and support services. Early intervention and legal representation in housing cases, and income maximisation and holistic, person-centred support. This case shows that housing debt is rarely just about rent. It's about health, caring, grief, poverty, and systems that are not designed with the real lives in mind. And with the right support at the right time, eviction was avoided, engagement was restored, and the client was given space to stabilise. But without intervention, the outcome could have been very different. We need systems that recognise vulnerability earlier, slow down enforcement where appropriate, and prioritise sustainable solutions over crisis response. Thank you for your time.
Thank you both, Gail and Morag. Such real richness from all that both of you have shared, really getting under the groups of people, particularly who are experiencing some of the worst of public debt recovery methods here in Scotland. And I just think that illustration, Gail, of just one person's experience just really shows us in depth how often the system can be failing. But I guess where the bright spots still exist in experiences like that, when support and advice and referrals onto specialist agencies can be put in place. We've had plenty of questions come through, but please don't hold back. We've got about the next 15 minutes to try to get through as many questions as we possibly can. Some of my colleagues have been answering some of the questions already so far in chat, and there's some others for us to take a look at. I think I'm going to start perhaps pulling the lens up. We've had a question that's come in really asking us about how fit for purpose is council tax at the moment. Probably most of us on this call are aware that council tax valuations on properties is going back to around about 1991. And there's been quite a bit of work that have been done by organisations like Tax Justice Scotland and others who've been doing some polling and trying to understand whether the public want to see change here. So I wonder if I could ask the panel their thoughts on whether it is that big picture, big systems change that's really needed. So David, I might come to you first of all in answering that.
Thanks, Emma. I think it's a thistle to be grasped by the next Scottish government, isn't it? And I think you've got a rare thing here where you've got consensus among public opinion. I think the polling that you referenced, 4 out of 5 people thought that the council tax was unfair. So you've got that groundswell of public opinion. And as has been articulated across all the speakers today, you've got real harm. You've got real harm caused by a system which clearly isn't working. And it manifests itself in the demand that our network sees and in the type of accounts and experiences that you've heard from colleagues today. And whilst we're not going to go into the depth and detail of what a reimagined council tax system looks like, for us there's got to be 2 principles that underpin that. It's got to be progressive, and it's got to properly understand and allow for the experiences of the type of people that the audience have heard about today, people in low incomes, people in vulnerable circumstances. That needs to be hardwired into the design of the system rather than something that leads to harm.
Morag, if I could come to you in terms of what sort of big picture, long-term lasting change you think is needed if we're to really support people.
Yes, it does need a new system completely. That's without a doubt. There's not just the Tax Justice Network, the Poverty and Inequality Commission, of which I'm a former deputy chair. We did a report on this. IPPR have done a report on this. So there's a lot of organisations, a lot of people who would advocate this. However, I think that's a bit of a long-term goal at the present time. There have been opportunities for this to happen and it hasn't. So I think in what you can do quite quickly is make the changes to the current system before thinking about an overhaul of the big system, because these current changes could be brought forward into a change overall. But so yes, it would be preferable to change the entire system, but in the meantime, there are things that could be done to improve how the system currently operates.
Thanks very much. There's few questions that have come in sort of asking us maybe what we think about this idea of slowing the process down. What might that look like in reality? And there's a couple of questions about sort of existing work that's maybe happening with local authorities to work collaboratively where there are issues. So I'm going to come to yourself first, Gail, and then you, Myles, in terms of just sort of any reflections on the difference that collaborative work with local authority can make for people, and what do we mean when we're saying slow it down? What might that start to look like so that people can get access to the advice that they really need in these circumstances? Go to you first, Gail.
Thanks, Emma. I think it's absolutely pivotal. We work incredibly closely with our local authority, and it's about understanding the clients that are coming to us for help. The local authority don't necessarily understand what the pitfalls are that our clients are experiencing. They're generally working in an office environment. They're distributing letters, quite rightly, chasing monies that are due, and they're not looking at it from a holistic point of view at all. They're looking at it as like numbers on a treadmill. We are engaging with the clients on a much more holistic basis, and it's about having the conversation not only with the client but actually with the local authority as well. And it's about understanding the bigger picture. And if we're able to have a conversation with the people on frontline services and the local authorities, that does definitely help create that change. And we've been very fortunate in East Lothian, where we've got a great working relationship with council tax and with housing teams, and we're able to create that change and get them to understand the pitfalls that the clients are facing and to ask for more flexibility and a little bit of freedom. And we've actually been able to advocate for the clients and create some change in terms of more time being sought for clients to basically pay payments back, or to look at the process that the council are putting into place on a local level. But local level is one thing, but it needs to be echoed across the other local authorities in Scotland, and that's where the big picture starts to happen. So lessons can be learned on a local level, but it needs to be fed up to the Scottish Government.
My apologies. Yeah, so there's a national project going on which Gail's SAB is involved with between the Citizens Advice Bureau Network and local authorities across Scotland. It's on a council tax debt project, and it's a really good project. There's a lot of good work going on collaboratively between the CABs and the local authorities, and there's kind of three themes to it. We're trying to the relationships between the local authority and the CABs in terms of like engaging with each other to make sure that the processes and referrals and points of contact are really in good shape. That helps. So it's very smooth conversations to be had around people who have got some council tax issues. We've got looking at council tax prevention in the first place. Is there what we can do there to stop that happening at the outset? But also then when it comes to the debt recovery, is there ways in which the process can be amended? And so there's work being done on that. Now, the slowing down of the process is absolutely vital. So if people can get that time and support and help, so yes, the councils need to collect that money in, but yes, as Gail was saying, there are individual circumstances that need to be catered for. And when the CABs step in and say, can we help this person who's got council tax, and the councils are very good, they'll put a pause on their account and they'll allow time for that person to get that support. We need more of that, and we need more of a system whereby individuals can, yes, they can also approach the council. They're also very wary about doing that from time to time because they're the people that are in debt to. Well, what can councils do to proactively identify who the most vulnerable people are, who are likely not to be able to pay or likely to be in have a difficulty in making the repayments once they fall behind. So there's a range of things to do, but the fact is that we've got on the ground collaborative work going on, and I think by having the agencies on the ground speaking to each other and working together, I think we can solve some of these problems from the bottom up as much as from the top down, where we're looking for the government to take some action going into the election.
Brilliant. I'm going to try and get through a few more questions if I can quickly. There's a number of questions that we've got that are sort of suggesting some innovations and some change that could be possible as part of this. We've had some question there about the potential for debt write-offs. There's another suggestion in there around perhaps landlords paying council tax directly. And I guess my question for the panel, maybe David, come to yourself, is this the sort of innovation and sort of different thinking that we perhaps need to see here, looking at this problem maybe from a different angle?
It's great to see the contributors in the audience have taken up our invitation to pitch in solutions. And absolutely, and I think there's something broader. If we take a sort of broader lens on what's been proposed here, I think what we need to do with council tax and any other issue is be aware of that sort of waterbed effect. You know, when you push down on one part of the problem and it can create other problems elsewhere. And I think that's, as we said at the outset, that's why we are determined to bring this insight to bear in the decision-making spaces in the months and indeed in the years ahead through the next Parliament. Because that advice provided by the network is overlapping, it's holistic, it's wrap around, we see where all these problems overlap and interconnect. So we take that same approach to pitching forward some of these types of innovative solutions that have been espoused in the chat. Yeah,
can I just come in and say there's one idea that we've been putting forward as part of the council tax project is a council tax write down. So it's not a write off. It doesn't go as far as that. It's a write down. So we're the individual is encouraged to pay their in-year payments, which is what the councils are very keen to get. But if they've got council tax debt, what happens is that the part of that council tax debt will be written down, just a part of it, for as long as they continue to make those in-year payments. That works well for the councils, and 5 councils have a model like this, and that's been working really well for them. And it's an idea that there's a few other councils that have picked up and are starting to be a bit more interested in this. But it doesn't go as far as a write down, because that is maybe a different kettle of fish to be dealing with. But a write down idea is something which I think there is something that could work for the individual, and it could work for the council as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Morag, please do come in.
Thanks. So I'm not speaking on behalf of CAS, I'm speaking on behalf of me and all the work that I've done over the years. There's a couple of things I think is really important when we think about the local authorities and their role in this. One is that Scotland has a 20-year statute of limitations on council tax debt compared to England and Wales 5 or 6 years. We have 20 years. The Scottish Government had the opportunity in the 2018 Prescriptions Act to change this, but there was a lot of pushback. So when you look at outstanding council tax debt and you look at it online in the Scottish Government, because it's publicly available information, you will find that it goes back right almost to 1999, the last time I looked a couple of years ago. So I do think that needs to be brought in line with England and Wales, and anything before that should be written off absolutely and completely. People should not be getting chased for this for 20 years. There was in Gateshead Council, they'd had a new approach to the non-payment of council tax that some councils here are starting to bring in a little bit. And that is, they saw it as they had a little project to see who were the can't pays and who were the won't pays. And they discovered that 95% of people who were not paying their council tax were can't pays and 5% were won't pays. So that 5% who refused to pay were still pushed through to the recovery process. The 95% were worked with, and it was seen as an opportunity for intervention to get close to the families and to provide what I would call a sticky service, where rather than sending somebody around the houses for support, you hold them close and you bring the services to them to say this is what that person needs, that family needs. And that was really successful in Gateshead. And I know there are local authorities in Scotland who are doing that type of work. And I'm really hopeful that that has a real opportunity to do better, because let's not forget, between around 96 to 97% of council tax is actually collected each year. Absolutely. We're not talking about huge amounts here. Absolutely. In terms of proportions.
So important that it's a small proportion of the overall take of council tax, but the proportion of harm that people are experiencing can be quite catastrophic and traumatic, and have a real knock-on effect on people's lives. We are, as ever, running out of time. I'm going to give the panel just a moment each to sort of perhaps put your pitch for just one thing that you want to see this next Scottish Government do. And we'll go David, Gail, Morag, and then Myles. Just very quickly, what would be the one thing if you had the chance for that government to do?
I'll repeat some language you've used already that I think covers what Morag mentioned around the sort of immediate change we need to see now, and the longer term change, and that's stop the harm, pause the process, rewire the system.
I think collaborative working is absolutely key. So Scottish Government working very, very closely with the third sector, and in turn thinking about longer term funding and ending cycles of 1-year funding.
Go for it, Morag.
Oh, sorry, is it me next? Beg pardon. I'm going to cheat and give you two. The first is the statute of limitations needs to be removed at 20 years. Is absurd, and it should be brought into line with England and Wales, which I think is 6 years or 5 years. And the next one is also what I haven't mentioned, but it's in my gendered report, and that is the idea of being jointly and severally liable. Because what we have is when there are situations where some men leave the household, and they go off radar a bit in terms of the electoral role and where are they living, the woman takes on the entirety of that debt and has to pay it for both parties. And I think that needs to change, because there is a gendered impact to council tax debt that's unfair.
Absolutely. And finally, Myles.
Yeah, a full-scale review, which brings everything into the mix. No more bits and pieces of changes. We've got to do everything together to make build a long-lasting, durable, sustainable system that's fair for individuals and fair for councils as well.
We are unfortunately out of time, friends. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us this afternoon. You'll just see dropping into the chat is just a really brief evaluation forum. We really love to get your feedback, so please do just take 30 seconds and just fill that out. This is episode 1 of our Election Insights series. We are going to be live in person at the gathering next week. If you're there at SCVO's 2-day conference, come and join us as we talk about maximising incomes, and we'll be online again on the 3rd of March talking about net zero. Again, the links so you can book your place are again in the chat. We really do thank you for your time, for your questions, for your engagement. Thank you to the panel, and hopefully we'll see you on an episode of foreCASt again soon. Thanks so much.